بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. Kitab at-Tauhid of Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala. Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab is well known, I would say, to all, to the friend and to the enemy, to the Sunni and to the Bid'i, to the one who has the correct Aqidah and the one who doesn't have the correct Aqidah. Kitab Tawheed bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, and the author, as I said, is well known. Someone has become well known, famous and infamous. And that's the Sunnah of Allah. The Sunnah of Allah is that when someone does something that is impactful and powerful, they become famous by their lovers and supporters, their friends. And they also become infamous by their enemies and their opponents, and those who are against them. Regardless of what their call was, or what their movement was, or their war, or their battles, or breakthrough in science or technology, al-muhim, if it was something which we call a game changer, something that changed the game. This person's movement changed the game. This person's breakthrough, or this person's discovery, or this person's legacy, it was something which nothing was ever the same afterwards. The Sunnah of Allah is that this person is going to become famous and infamous. Alright? They're going to become known by their enemies and by their loved ones. And oftentimes their enemies won't like them because they're their enemies, but they'll admire them, or they'll respect them. And oftentimes you find some enemies who may even love them, but for one reason or another, we're enemies. So that is exactly what happened with Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala. He was very famous, he was very well known with regards to what took place and with regards to what happened during his lifetime. Ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah, we can draw and call upon so many different lessons from his life, and his time, and his area where he came from, his region, the environment, and many of the things that he did and he called to and supported and fought for were nothing more of him being a product of his environment and him being a victim of his time. He said, he spoke about, he talked about, he wrote about what he was around, what was around him, the problems that he faced, the ills and the woes that the Ummah has suffered in his century and in his region. And that's why it's very important when we read about these great ulama and these imams, and we read about their lives and where they came from and how they were raised. You'll have a better understanding of this imam when you know where he came from. What part of the world was he from? And what was the atmosphere, the political atmosphere, the religious atmosphere? All right, what was the technology? What was the status of the Muslims in this century, the 11th century, the 12th century in Arabia? What was going on at that time? In the 13th century, the 10th century, before and after his life, what was going on at that time? What made him write this? What made him make this movement, make this change? Do you understand? So that's critically important. That's critically important for any imam, let alone someone like Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala. So when you talk about how did this imam make this mistake, or how is Fulan Ash'ari, or he has Aqidah Ash'ariyah, or he has some mistakes in this book, you have to understand where he came from, what madhab he was on, what city he was in Egypt, what century he was, and what was widespread at that time, what was orthodox at that time, what was acceptable at that time, who was boycotted and ostracized and kicked out of the circles of ilm at that time. And it allows you to have a better understanding and even some compassion and sympathy sometimes for certain things. So Ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, you have to read about his life. You have to read about his life. And those who hate him, or those who love him, those who are Muslim and those who are non-Muslim in general, they're all going to agree to the general they're all going to come to a general consensus and agreement of the religious and political atmosphere of the time in which Ibn Abdul Wahhab was brought up and raised and grew up. They pretty much agree that Arabia at that time was suffering from many religious cancers, many different schisms and groups, problems. It was suffering in the political sphere as well. The rival chieftains, the areas that were subbed out by the Ottomans, in which they would allow other chieftains to have some relative control over it. Micromanagement, macromanagement. We don't care what you do. You can kill each other. We don't care. Just pay us this amount of gold at the end of each month, and then we'll let you live. You're under the caliphate or the khilafah of the Ottomans, who were obviously based in Constantinople or Istanbul, Turkey, or wherever they were in Turkey, where their headquarters were. It wasn't always necessarily in Istanbul. So with that being said, the non-Muslims and the Muslims generally agree of what was going on in the time of Ibn Abdul Wahhab and how he grew up and how he was raised. They generally agree on this. Now, in our Sharh of Al-Usul al-Thalatha, we mentioned some of these principles, which are very, very important. And obviously, if we take a bigger book such as Kitab at-Tauhid, then we have to step up and graduate a bit and have to mention some other principles and some other points and some other historic background in greater depth, in some type of greater depth. So with that being said, they generally agree of the time in which Muhammad ibn Wahhab grew up. Obviously, they differ on, was his understanding of Islam correct or incorrect? Was his practice correct or incorrect? Was his da'wah right or wrong, hurtful or helpful to the Muslims? But they agree what caused it and what was going on with regards to his upbringing, the Hanbali madhab, so on and so forth. As far as his different definitions and categories and his understandings of certain things, then of course later on they differ on those things as well. And some people say that he was directly influenced by the two sheikhs, Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn al-Qayyim. And that was the majority, 90%, if not more than that, of his opinions and views in the religion and the deen, with regards to Aqidah and with regards to fiqh and da'wah and jihad and takfir and so on and so forth. And then there are others who say rather he was directly influenced by them, but he himself branched off into his own ijtihad and his own understanding, his own opinions. And the bulk or the chunk of it is from Ibn Taymiyyah and Ibn Qayyim, but a big part of it is from him. And it's not 90%, but one may say 70% or 60%. And 60-40 is still a big ratio. And others, they say, a third group, that all the things that he came with and brought were all new and made up. And no one from the ulama ever said what he said before him. And no one ever classified it or categorized it before he did in the way in which he did. And he made total shudud and mukhalafa of the ijma' of the ulama with regards to ibadah and tawheed, etc. And then there's another group, a fourth group, who say that Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, he only said what he said and did what he did for the political and financial interests of the House of Saud, the Saud family, and them solidifying their grip of power on Arabia and the Arabian Peninsula. And also, or before that, which led to that, was the corroboration with the British, cooperating with the non-Muslims and the imperialists and those who had interests in Arabia. From the top of those interests was the destruction and the crippling and the breaking of the back of the Turks. Now, there are different theories and opinions and views on the Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, etc. All prove what I just said to you, that he was famous and infamous. And there's no way that he could have been this famous and this infamous unless he didn't, or unless he did something which was major. No doubt about that. And what he did was impactful and it was eventful. Tayyip. So the people who say that Muhammad Abdul Wahab took support from the British, and some say he was funded by them and supported by them and hired by them, and based off of that, he made up the different understandings of ibadah and tawheed and shirk and kufr to declare them to be kuffar, to kill them, to solidify the power, and to wreak havoc upon the people that were leading and governing the peninsula and exploiting the peninsula at that time. Regardless, whether you say it was the Turks or whether it was the people who came before the Turks, the Egyptians, the Bashas, those who had influence, those who had power, etc. We all know for sure that later on, through his grandsons, his offspring, his progeny, the people who came about and came along in the time of World War One, before and after, in which the Turks, along with the Germans and the Austrians and others, were considered the Axis powers fighting against the Allies in World War One. And what happened after World War One, when the Axis were defeated and the Allies were triumphant and victorious, Britain, France, etc., so on and so forth, right? And then after that, what happened in Palestine, the Armenian War, the battle there, 1948, before and after World War II, all of the chain of events that took place afterwards, the domino effect, all right, the events that were spawned from what took place in Najd in the time of Ibn Abdul Wahab, all right, all those different pieces of history, let alone the Aqidah there, the Aqidah of the people in Egypt, the Aqidah of the people in Turkey, etc., the Aqidah of the people of Najd, the fiqh, the ibadah, the innovations, the sins, the fawahish, all of those things are critically important to understand his legacy and understand what he did and what he didn't do, and to understand what he left behind and that which was made up and invented against him. And no matter what the case is, and no matter what happened or what didn't happen, we know for sure is that he made a mark on the world by Allah's permission. He left something behind, and that's because he became famous and infamous. That's the qaida. No one is going to reach that level of being a household name in the prestigious Ivy League universities and colleges around the world to talk about religion and Islam, and he's a reformist, and he was this and he was that, the Wahhabi way, the Wahhabi creed, the Wahhabi Aqidah. It had to mean something for it to become that widespread and that popular. And if he was just some average Joe Blow Arabian Bedouin preacher in the desert, we wouldn't be talking about him today. Muslim and non-Muslim, those who love and those who hate. So that's the point I'm trying to make, and that's the qaida that I'm trying to make. And like I said before, it's the sunnah of Allah for great men and women to have controversy surrounding them. That's the sunnah of Allah, to have great men and women to become surrounded by controversy and by rumor, and even oftentimes scandal, and oftentimes blatant lies. People lie on them, they're enemies. Or they don't lie, but they misconstrue information, or they hide things, or they jumble things, or maybe there were certain issues and mistakes and errors or other ulterior motives. Allahu alam. But that doesn't take away from what is in this book and what is in his other books of establishing what he established. So that's just a brief crash course of history and of politics, all things which had an influence, and all things which had an effect, and all things which were a cause and an after effect of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab and the event of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab. Khairan, inshallah. We don't want to go too deep in that. We don't want to get lost in that any further, in which we already are. So the book, it says Kitab at-Tauhid, the book of Tawheed. The ulama of Islam, they differ on what's the order of studying the books of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahab. What's the order? After they generally agree that Usul al-Thalatha should come first. In general. And others, they may say, no, not Usul al-Thalatha, but a smaller book. A smaller book. Al-Wajibat, Al-Mutahattimat al-Ma'rifa. That book, Al-Wajibat, المتحتمات المعرفة على كل مسلم ومسلمة, the title or the name of that book, which has pieces from Usul al-Thalatha as a summary, along with the conditions of La ilaha illallah, the invalidators of al-Islam, and the main qawa'id of the deen. Some say that comes before Usul al-Thalatha, and then afterwards you study al-Usul al-Thalatha, and then they differ on what books come, or what book comes after Usul al-Thalatha with regards to the student of knowledge trying to systematically study it. Is it al-Qawaid al-Arba', the four principles? Is it Kitab at-Tauhid? Is it Kashf al-Shubuhat? وهكذا. So some say Kitab at-Tauhid should come first. Others say al-Qawaid al-Arba'. Others may say Kashf al-Shubuhat. And obviously one of the benefits of Kashf al-Shubuhat is that you learn Tawheed from refuting shirk. Is taught. Alright? So they differ on the specific tartib of the books. There lies no doubt that if a person studied al-Usul al-Thalatha and then went into Kitab al-Tawhid, that's fine. And if you put Qawaid al-Arba' first, that's fine. Even if you study Kashf al-Shubuhat first, al-Muhim, la bas. And perhaps the most correct way is to take Kitab al-Tawhid before Kashf al-Shubuhat. Wallahu Azza wa Jal alam. طيب. So, why did Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab write this book? Did he write the book as a manual, as a primer? Did he write the book as some type of memorial to show the people this is what we're upon, and this is what we're calling to, and this is what we believe with regards to what's going on in the Arabian Peninsula? Or did he write the book for his students, etc.? Kitab at-Tawhid. Another prince, it says, الذي هو حق الله على العبيد. The book of Tawheed, which is the haqq of Allah upon his servants, the Tawheed, and for his servants to give him and to pronounce and declare his Tawheed is his haqq, is his right. طيب. With that being said, we'll go right into the book. Or before we go into the book, a few things about the book. First and foremost is, the book is unique. Extremely unique book. How he wrote it, how he authored it, how he organized it and ordered it. It was very unique and very special. And another very important point about the book with regards to the modern day people today is that we have three classes of people. We have those two classes which go to utter extremes. First class will say there's no good in the book. And the book destroyed the Muslims, it split up the Muslims, it separated the Muslims, it spilled the blood of the Muslims, it made takfir of the Muslims, it allowed the non-Muslims to come into the Muslim lands, the Middle East. It allowed the non-Muslims to know all they have to do to get the Muslims to fight and kill each other is supply money, supply guns, supply information, etc. And there's no good in the book. And then we have others who say the exact opposite. That the book is totally perfect. And there's nothing like it. And it's free from mistake. It's free from error. No one can criticize it. Anyone who criticizes the book is going to disrespect Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, disrespect the ulama, disrespect the aqidah of Ahl-Sunnah. Anyone who criticizes the book is supporting the people of shirk and bid'ah and kufr. You can't say the hadith is da'if. You can't say it's weak. Even if the hadith is totally da'if, it has a correct meaning. There's no hadith that he mentioned that's da'if unless the meaning is supported by other texts. So on and so on and so forth, blah, 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 blah. No criticism whatsoever. Not on any aqidah issue. Not criticizing any hadith, any athar, or actually criticizing an actual mistake, a khata, a wahm, fi takhrij or al-azl, in which the author says that this person collected the hadith, but he didn't. Or Ibn Qayyim said this, but it's really Ibn Taymiyyah who said it. وهكذا. You can't say anything. And if you say anything, you're an enemy to the correct aqidah. And then we have the people who are in the middle who say, there's no doubt the book is an amazing book. Extremely beneficial book. Groundbreaking book, impactful book, no question about that. But under any circumstance, is the book free from mistake and error? Under any circumstance, is the book infallible and the author infallible? Under any circumstance, is Kitab at-Tauhid the Quran? Under any circumstance, is it free from any type of shortcoming? And there are shortcomings in the book, and there are mistakes in the book, and there are errors, mistakes, and actual scientific errors, khata ilmi, which is wrong, according to some researchers and some scholars who hold that view. Usages of certain hadiths, weakness, some hadiths being fabricated, made up in the book, no doubt about that. And some ulama, some scholars today, they say this is one of the problems that you come across when you study and teach Kitab at-Tauhid. You come across those weak hadiths, or some of those hadiths which are munkar, which are not authentic, and even in the meaning. Do you keep silent about them? Or do you explain and point it out to the people's attention, and the people lose respect and lose trust for the imam and for their aqeedah, etc.? So you're stuck between a rock and a hard place. Al-Muhim, there is no book after the Quran which is absolutely perfect. Nothing. There's no book after the Quran Kareem which is cover to cover absolutely free from any type of criticism or discrepancy. That's our aqeedah as Muslims. Okay? That's the correct view with regards to this book. طيب. So, these are, in my humble opinion, some critical points of reflection. Critical points of reflection for this book, for anyone who wants to study this book, and anyone who wants to study anything else from the books of Imam Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala and benefit from them. Obviously, the little bit that I give you, you can't satisfy yourself with. You have to go back and read more books in Arabic and in English. Read the books of history. Go on Wikipedia. Go on to other websites. Do Google searches and read about Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab. Read about his life. See what the enemies say about him. See what his friends say about him. See what the scholars of Islam say about him. See what the different madhabs say about him. See what scholars in Turkey and Egypt and other places say about him. And you'll have yaqeen for yourself. You'll know what to think and what to believe yourself. All right? And when you hear something and see something from different people who are enemies or opponents, oftentimes that gives you coolness of yaqeen, because you see that they're repeating the same thing over and over again. And they're just saying the same thing over and over again. They're just being redundant in their jargon, which goes to show that they're all following the first person who made up the lie, the first person who fabricated the story. All right? So there's many benefits in doing your own research based off of or in light of what I just gave to you. Based off of or in light of what I just gave to you of the historic background. Of the historic background of Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab rahimahullah ta'ala, his dawah, his books, and the things that were going on in his region and in his time. But do not suffice yourself with those summarized points. Don't suffice yourself with what I'm giving you briefly. Read, research, go back and study yourselves. Read, research, go back and study yourself, and use the points that I've given you to fill in the other missing parts. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. That's my advice. Another very important piece of advice is that Kitab at-Tauhid should be memorized. You should try your best to memorize the book. It's not impossible to memorize. It's not even difficult to memorize. Take a chapter take one chapter at a time. It's not that hard. It's very easy to do, inshallah, if you put your mind to it. If you have a teacher, if you have a study group, sisters that you study with, etc., brothers that you study with, it's not difficult to do it, bi-idhnillahi azza wa jal. So the book should be memorized. And like any other book that you're trying to memorize, always make sure that you're reading it properly, and that you have the tashkilat, and that you're not mispronouncing the words. Because if you mispronounce something when you're reading it, you end up memorizing it, mispronouncing it, and passing it on during a class or a khutbah or a lecture or a halaqah. And then you teach your students and it's messed up. So you have to make tasheeh. You have to rectify the mistake of your tongue. Read it carefully, slowly. Have your teacher read it to you carefully and slowly, with all of the vowels, clear, slow, loud voice, and go over it over and over again. And after you have the proper reading and recitation, make sure that you memorize it strongly. Review it until you spit up and vomit, until you become sick. Go over it again and again and again and again and again until you perfected it, because it's very, very important information. And a book like this or any metin is something that you want to have mahfuz, memorized by heart. Memorized by heart. Okay? So that's first and foremost. Secondly is, if you can't memorize the text, طيب لا بأس. If you can't memorize it, make sure you read it several times. And listen to the audio several times, over and over again. If you can't memorize it by heart, then at least familiarize yourself with the text of the book. Familiarize yourself. Be familiar with it. All right? And once you hear the hadith, and even though you don't know by heart, but you know the rest of the hadith, you know what's going to come, what's the next word that's going to come, just by listening to it, you can follow along with it quicker than the average or normal person. Very important point. And this is with regards to anything that you're trying to study. If you can't memorize it by heart, then at least familiarize yourself. Be familiar with the text by reading it and by listening to it being read. And by listening to it being read. Khairan, inshallah. Before you even get into the sharh, and this sharh, make sure that you try to memorize it or familiarize yourself with it. Number 3 is when it comes to reading an explanation of this book, make sure that you take the explanation which is the shortest, and the explanation which is the easiest to understand. The shortest and the easiest. But that's not always possible. Sometimes the shortest book isn't the easiest book. And you may take an example of this, some of the smaller versions of the book in comparison, or the smaller version of the sharh, in comparison to Al-Qawl al-Mufid of Shaykh ibn Uthaymin rahimahullah, which used to be 3 volumes, and then condensed it into 2 big volumes. If I'm not mistaken, it was 3 volumes. For sure, it's two big volumes, which is relatively big, relatively large. But when you sit down and read Shaykh Uthaymin's style, especially for the beginner, the student of knowledge who's a beginner, you find that it may be easier to understand. The Arabic is easier. The examples he mentions are far more simple than a smaller hashiyah, notes, in which it's not that clear, or the Arabic is on a very high plane. All right? So if you have the ability to do smallest and easiest, then of course that's what you do. And if you don't, then you go with that which is easiest, because sometimes smaller isn't easier. Sometimes smaller isn't easier. Khairan, inshallah ta'ala. As far as the audio sharh, then you should do both. Listen to the explanation, whether it's mine or someone else's, better than mine's, and read it. And don't just read one explanation, but read several explanations. Read several shuruh of the book. And these are qawaid for any metin that you're studying. Don't suffice yourself with one sharh if it's a very important metin. As far as it's a metin which you just study and you know is simple and basic, then that's one thing. But if it's something that's of importance, then you should read and study it, have the best understanding of it that you possibly can. And oftentimes the human being's brain is allowed to comprehend and encompass something easier when you get it from different aspects and from different avenues. Different aspects and different avenues. So these are all dawabit amma, general principles, general guidelines for the successful systematic study of any metin. The successful systematic study of any metin, let alone this metin, Kitab at-Tauhid, a metin on aqidah, and especially the core of aqidah, the aqidah of ibadah, worshipping Allah Azza wa Jalla alone without any partner, and doing away with shirk. What could be more important than that? What could be more substantial than that? And the last thing that I'll say in this session, like we said in the Sharh of Usul al-Thalatha, with regards to the opponents of Abdul Wahhab, or those who believe the importance of Aqidah, but they feel Ibn Abdul Wahhab may have stretched some things out too much, or he may have made some ijtihadat based off of political gain. Isn't it convenient if these guys are our enemies, if we declare them to be kuffar, we can kill them without any guilt. We can take over their land, conquer their land, and solidify our power in the peninsula without no problem if we deem them to be kuffar because they're worshiping and they're saying this is the definition of worship and it's the ta'rif of ilah and so on and so forth. Those who have doubts, let alone those who are staunch enemies, we say, like we said in the Sharh of Usul al-Thalatha, that maybe Ibn Abdul Wahhab was wrong and he was this and he was that. Okay, maybe, mumkin. Allahu alam. We'll all know on the Yawm al-Qiyamah when we stand in front of Allah. May Allah protect us from that day. But what aqidah is there that you would suggest for the people? What would you suggest? Would you suggest us going to soothsayers, palm readers? Would you suggest for us to have superstition, amulets and talismans? Would you suggest that we worship Allah at the graveyard, sit in the graveyard? Would you suggest that we say one Nabi, we swear by the Prophet, or Sharaf, by the nobility? And I've witnessed these things. I've witnessed these things overseas. I've met people. I've met them in Muslim countries in which you're having a normal conversation in the marketplace. You ask about a price and a person will say, what Nabi? Just like that. He'll say, what Sharaf? I swear by this. It's a reality. Or do you want the people to slaughter for the jinn? Do you want the people to make these different types of bid'ah and the different types of kufr? Is that the aqidah that you want for the people? Because if it's not the aqidah of Ibn Abdul Wahhab's aqidah, what aqidah is there what that you suggest that focuses on knowledge and reading and studying? Qala Allah Ta'ala, wa dalilu qawluhu Ta'ala. What aqidah focuses on that and gets the people to be conscious and aware of their aqidah, like Muhammad Abdul Wahhab did of the modern era? Further, please replace it with a better way. It's very important, and it's something that most people forget about when they warn from something or from someone. They don't give a solution. They don't give a substitute. Don't do this. Don't take from this. Don't go here. This is bad. This person. All right, no problem. Then what? What do we read? What do we study? What do we follow? So we have to be very, very careful of all of this. And with Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is all success.